Welcome to China Considered, a podcast that brings fresh insight and informed discussion to one of the most consequential issues of our time, how China is changing and changing the world. I'm Liz Economy, Hargrove Senior Fellow and co-director of the program on the U.S., China, and the World at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Today we're going to focus on the relationship between the European Union and China, with a dash of the United States and Russia sprinkled in. July was a big month for the EU. It celebrated 50 years of diplomatic relations with China, and it signed a trade agreement with the United States, all while continuing to support Ukraine in its fight against Russian aggression. So to help us understand how the EU is keeping its head above water with all that's going on, we're going to speak with Noah Barkin, who is a senior advisor with the Rhodium Group, as well as a visiting senior fellow with the German Marshall Fund. He's based in Berlin, but we're lucky to get him while he's visiting here in the United States. Welcome, Noah.
Hi, Liz. Great to be here.
So the big news in EU-China relations is the summit that the two sides had in late July, celebrating 50 years of diplomatic relations. I want to get your take on what happened, what you think is coming next, but first let's level set the relationship. If you look back over the past decade or even more, what do you see as the defining moments in the relationship? How should we understand the evolution of the bilateral relationship?
Well, I think looking at it from a European perspective, I would maybe start with the takeover by Chinese firm Midea of German robotics maker KUKA in 2016. Began to understand that deeper economic ties with China posed a substantial risk. And I think it was also the moment when European capitals realized that they needed new instruments to deal with this threat. Other events in recent years, I think that back in 2019, the European Commission published a document, Strategic Outlook on China, which labeled China shift, I think, in how Europe thought and described China. I think Europe had always sort of soft-pedaled its rhetoric on China, and that was sort of a break from that and a signal that Europe was going to be talking, calling a spade, talking a bit more frankly about the relationship. The pandemic had a big impact, of course. I think that triggered a sort of a slide in public opinion in Europe towards, and then of course the China's support for Russia, the no limits partnership that Xi and Putin struck just shortly before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and China's ongoing support for Russia has had a huge impact on Europe-China relations. And I think, ever since European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen gave this speech back in 2023, where she talked about de-risking as the sort of primary strategy towards China. I think we've seen a sort of a ramping up on the European side of economic measures to push back against China. So I think that speech was also significant in that it signaled a more robust European approach to some of the economic challenges related to China.
I remember that speech. I was at the Commerce Department at the time, and it was such a great framing, that notion of de-risking, not decoupling, that, of course, we adopted it as well. I think that's become the frame for the U.S. Let me just ask you a little bit more about that first event that you mentioned, which was the Chinese in 2016. Was it that they suddenly realized, the Europeans and the Germans suddenly realized that China was a much bigger economic competitor than they had sort of assumed? Or this, just what would have had the same, this, just what impact, for example, if it had been a U.S. firm that had come at this out?
Well, I think it was that that China was employing a sort of top-down strategy. Of course, Made in China 2025 was launched a year earlier. There had been other takeovers that had caused concerns. You might remember back in the Obama administration, there was an attempt to take over a German semiconductor firm, Extron, where the Obama administration intervened because the Germans were gonna approve that, and that deal was reversed in the end. But it was the same.